Congresswoman Kat Kamak here.
Thanks, Congresswoman.
The committee will come to order. I note that a quorum is present, and it is now in order to take up the postponed votes. Our unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on the amendment number 3 to H.R. 7606, offered by Mr. Rouser of North Carolina. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Chairman.
No.
Chairman votes no. Mr. Costa. Mr. Costa. Mr. McGovern.
No.
Mr. McGovern votes no. Ms. Adams.
Adams votes no.
Ms. Adams votes no. Ms. Spanberger.
No.
Ms. Spanberger votes no. Mrs. Hayes.
Hayes votes no.
Mrs. Hayes votes no. Mr. Delgado. Mr. Delgado. Ms. Brown.
Brown votes no.
Ms. Brown votes no. Mr. Rush.
Rush votes no.
Mr. Rush votes no. Ms. Pingree.
Pingree votes no.
Ms. Pingree votes no. Mr. Sablon. Mr. Sablon. Ms. Custer.
Custer votes no.
Ms. Custer votes no. Ms. Bustos.
No.
Ms. Bustos votes no. Mr. Maloney. Mr. Maloney. Ms. Plaskett.
Plaskett votes no.
Ms. Plaskett votes no. Mr. O'Halloran.
O'Halloran votes no.
Mr. O'Halloran votes no. Mr. Carbajal.
Carbajal votes no.
Mr. Carbajal votes no. Mr. Khanna.
No.
Mr. Khanna votes no. Mr. Lawson.
No.
Mr. Lawson votes no. Mr. Correa.
No.
Mr. Correa votes no. Ms. Craig.
ICC double script completely covers some islands in the near future. Every small
Ms. Craig.
says that climate change is their biggest national security concern. And to that end,
Mr. Harder.
No.
Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. Axney.
No.
Mrs. Axney votes no. Ms. Schreier.
size-fits-all solution to return to
Schreier votes no.
Ms. Schreier votes no. Mr. Panetta.
continue working with our governor and with peoples to ensure that any
Mr. Panetta.
effectively
Panetta votes no.
Mr. Panetta votes no. Mr. Bishop.
done
Mr. Bishop votes no.
Mr. Bishop votes no. Ms. Capter.
Captor votes no, thank you.
How is Sablon recorded?
Ms. Capter votes no. Mr. Thompson.
Mr. Thompson votes yes.
Mr. Thompson votes yes. Mr. Austin Scott.
Yes.
Mr. Austin Scott votes yes. Mr. Crawford.
Yes.
Mr. Crawford votes yes. Mr. Desjardins.
Yes.
Mr. Desjardins votes yes. Mrs. Hartzler.
Yes.
Mrs. Hartzler votes yes. Mr. LaMalfa. Mr. LaMalfa.
Aye.
Mr. LaMalfa votes aye. Mr. Davis.
Davis votes yes.
Mr. Davis votes yes. Mr. Allen.
Allen votes yes.
Mr. Allen votes yes. Mr. Rouser.
Aye.
Mr. Rouser votes aye. Mr. Kelly.
Kelly votes yes.
Mr. Kelly votes yes. Mr. Bacon.
Yes.
Mr. Bacon votes yes. Mr. Johnson.
Johnson votes aye.
Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Baird.
Aye.
Mr. Baird votes aye. Mr. Jacobs.
Jacobs, aye.
Mr. Jacobs votes aye. Mr. Balderson.
Alderson votes aye.
Mr. Balderson votes aye. Mr. Cloud. Mr. Cloud votes aye. Mr. Mann.
Aye.
Mr. Mann votes aye. Mr. Feenstra.
Aye.
Mr. Feenstra votes aye. Mrs. Miller.
Yes.
Mrs. Miller votes yes. Mr. Moore.
Yes.
Mr. Moore votes yes. Mrs. Kamick.
Kamak votes aye.
Mrs. Kamick votes aye. Mrs. Fishbach.
Fishbach votes aye.
Mrs. Fishbach votes aye. Mr. Costa.
Secretary of State Bradford and Deputy Secretary
Mr. Costa.
confirmed in recent Senate testimony
Mr. Delgado.
will consider any matters raised by Fireby in response to questions from members of the Senate.
Mr. Delgado.
Proposals for additional
Mr. Sablon.
No.
Mr. Sablon votes no. Mr. Maloney.
Maloney votes no.
Mr. Maloney votes no. Ms. Craig. Ms. Craig?
Ms. Craig votes no.
Ms. Craig votes no.
Madam Clerk, how is Mr. Bishop recorded?
Mr. Bishop is recorded as no. I mean, we can call him back. He's not on camera now. There he is.
Have all members voted? Does any member wish to change his or her vote? If not, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the yeas were 22, the nays were 25.
A majority having voted in opposition, the amendment is not agreed to. We have now voted on all amendments on which roll call votes were postponed. The question now recurs on the motion to report H.R. 7606 favorably to the House. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Chairman votes aye. Mr. Costa.
One more time and then.
Mr. Costa. Mr. McGovern.
Aye.
Mr. McGovern votes aye. Ms. Adams.
Adams votes aye.
Ms. Adams.
A recorded vote has not been requested.
Any technical assistance?
Adams votes aye.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the measure is agreed to.
I think so.
Say it.
You're going to have to ask for recorded votes so everybody can
Let it go.
can't shortcut it.
We got it.
That's fine, Cappuccino. I didn't know what to get. So.
Did you record that?
Yeah, 2 minutes.
Okay. Questions for the yeas. Okay, say this. A record. The question now occurs on recording HR 7607 favorably to the House.
I couldn't make it there.
All those in favor say aye.
But then I would have needed to do these.
People need to mute
Yes,
themselves,
but you
please.
skipped a part, so we need to say.
We haven't done a voice
So,
vote yet.
repeat after me. Repeat after me. Repeat after me. The question now occurs on recording HR 7607 favorably to the House.
The question now occurs to report 7607 to the House.
All those in favor say aye.
All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed say
All those opposed?
Crawford, no.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it,
the ayes have it and the measure is agreed.
and the measure is agreed to. Thank you all.
This concludes today's business meeting. I thank the members in.
Mr. Chairman, I would ask for recorded yeas and yays, please.
All right.
All right.
The requests for yeas and nays have been made. Clerk, please call the roll.
Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Costa. Mr. Costa. Mr. McGovern.
Aye.
Mr. McGovern votes aye. Ms. Adams.
Adams votes aye.
Ms. Adams votes aye. Ms. Spanberger.
Aye.
Ms. Spanberger votes aye. Mrs. Hayes.
I'm sorry, Hayes votes aye.
Mrs. Hayes votes aye. Mr. Delgado. Mr. Delgado. Ms. Brown.
Brown votes aye.
Ms. Brown votes aye. Mr. Rush.
Rush votes aye.
Mr. Rush votes aye. Ms. Pingree.
Pingree votes aye.
Ms. Pingree votes aye. Mr. Sablon.
Sablon votes aye.
Mr. Sablon votes aye. Ms. Custer.
Custer votes aye.
Ms. Custer votes aye. Ms. Bustos.
Yes.
Ms. Bustos votes aye. Mr. Maloney. Mr. Maloney. Ms. Plaskett.
Plaskett votes aye.
Ms. Plaskett votes aye. Mr. O'Halloran.
Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded?
Mr. Maloney, you are not recorded.
Mr. Chairman?
How is Mr. Maloney reported?
Mr. Maloney is not reported.
Mr. Maloney, would you report?
Mr. Maloney votes yes.
Mr.
Thank
Maloney
you.
votes yes. Mr. O'Halloran.
Mr. O'Halloran votes aye.
Mr. O'Halloran votes aye. Mr. Carbajal.
Carbajal votes aye.
Mr. Carbajal votes aye. Mr. Khanna.
Aye.
Mr. Khanna votes aye. Mr. Lawson.
Yes.
Mr. Lawson votes aye. Mr. Correa.
Correa votes aye.
Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Craig.
We got a little ways to go.
Craig of Minnesota votes aye.
Ms. Craig votes aye. Mr. Harder.
Aye.
Mr. Harder votes aye. Mrs. Axney.
Aye.
Mrs. Axney votes aye. Ms. Schreier.
Schreier votes aye.
Ms. Schreier votes aye. Mr. Panetta.
Aye.
Mr. Panetta votes aye. Mr. Bishop.
Mr. Bishop votes aye.
Mr. Bishop votes aye. Mrs. Capter.
Capter votes aye.
Mrs. Capter votes aye. Mr. Thompson.
No.
Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Austin Scott.
No.
Mr. Austin Scott votes no. Mr. Crawford.
That's a no for me.
Mr. Crawford votes no. Mr. Desjardins.
No.
Mr. Desjardins votes no. Mrs. Hartzler.
No.
Mrs. Hartzler votes no. Mr. LaMalfa.
No.
Mr. LaMalfa votes no. Mr. Davis.
Davis votes no.
Mr. Davis votes no. Mr. Allen.
Allen votes no.
Mr. Allen votes no. Mr. Rouser.
No.
Mr. Rouser votes no. Mr. Kelly.
No.
Mr. Kelly votes no. Mr. Bacon.
No.
Mr. Bacon votes no. Mr. Johnson.
Johnson votes aye.
Mr. Johnson votes aye.
Of all of us,
Mr. Baird.
No.
Mr. Baird votes no. Mr. Jacobs.
That's right.
Jacobs, no.
Mr. Jacobs votes no. Mr. Balderson.
Balderson, no.
Mr. Balderson votes no. Mr. Cloud.
No.
Mr. Cloud votes no. Mr. Mann.
No.
Mr. Mann votes no. Mr. Feenstra.
No.
Mr. Feenstra votes no. Mrs. Miller.
No.
Mrs. Miller votes no. Mr. Moore.
No.
Mr. Moore votes no. Mrs. Kamick.
Kamak votes nay.
Mrs. Kamick votes no. Mrs. Fishbach.
Fishbach votes no.
Mrs. Fishbach votes no. Mr. Costa. Mr. Costa. Mr. Delgado.
Yay. Delgado votes aye.
Delgado votes yay.
Okay.
Have all members voted? Does any member wish to change his or her vote? If not, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the yeas are 27, the nays are 21.
A majority having voted in favor, H.R. 7607 is agreed to, and the measure and the accompanying materials shall be reported favorably to the House. Without objection,
7606, sorry. HR 7607, 7606.
H.R. 706.
7606. 7606.
7606 is agreed to. And the measure and accompanying material shall be reported favorably to the House. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. And if any member wishes to file supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views to any of the legislation that was under consideration during the business meeting, please have them submitted to the clerk's office at 1303 Longworth by 12 p.m. on Friday, May 20th.
Mr. Chairman, minority will be filing dissenting views.
Without objection, the staff are authorized to make such technical or conforming changes as are appropriate without changing the substance of the legislation. This concludes today's business. I thank all members, and the meeting is adjourned.